Hi, I'm Rebecca Lucero and I'm your instructor this semester. Today we're going to be talking on the brain science of addiction. Some of you might already know some of this from 2310, where you studied addiction. We're going to be talking about addiction again, just kind of doing a refresher so that we'll be able to incorporate this into family dynamics as we go along in the course. So I'm going to take you through this PowerPoint today to refresh some things and hopefully add some things to the knowledge that you already have. First off, I want to talk about how addiction is a brain disease. This is a certain model that we like to use at Tech. Estimates are that 50 to 70% of the variability and susceptibility to becoming addicted is accounted for by genetic factors. So this is something that's really important for you to keep in mind. Often I find that children of alcoholics have a lot of concerns, for their offspring about the propensity towards the disease. So also this is relevant for people who are adopting, right? If you're adopting a child who is a child of somebody who was a drug addict, and that might be the reason that the child's being given up for adoption, that particular child might have a greater propensity or susceptibility to developing an addiction later in life. So just like other diseases that tend to be genetic, addiction works the same. Some of you might be able to think in your own family about the concerns that you have about your propensity towards a certain disease and the precautions that you take to avoid having environmental triggers or health habits that might increase your chances of contracting that particular disease. So that's something to be aware of as we talk about this. Another thing to think about when we're talking about addiction as a brain disease is that over time, the addict is losing control over his voluntary behavior. When we think about the fact that the brain is the organ that's being affected, this makes a little bit more sense. That is the sick organ, but it's interesting because this is the particular organ that controls a lot of what we do and how we behave. So keep that in mind as well. We're going to talk about the effects of addiction on the brain. One thing to keep in mind is that drugs are going to affect your mood, memory, perception, and emotional state. Often you will hear people talk about how, my husband is a different person when he's drinking than when he's sober. I work as a marriage and family therapist, so I see a lot of different clients. Sometimes they are in recovery already. Sometimes I meet with couples where one person is an addict and the other person is not. And so often I'll hear things like that about how the addict is often a different person when they are partaking of the substances when they're not. Also, not that someone's a completely different person, but the person can definitely change when they enter recovery because of how much the drugs have altered just, mood, memory, perception, emotional state, all of that. Another thing to keep in mind is that when drugs are used over time, they're going to create new pathways in the brain. They're rerouting their brain. And David Rosenblum said they can't stop because the brain has been changed. The brain has been changed in a way to keep the addiction going. Getting into recovery becomes very difficult because you're literally challenging your brain and the pathways that you've set there. So again, this next paragraph is talking a little bit more about the new circuits being created in the brain, the new connections, and this is why recovery can take a long time. Even though you might be sober from the drug or the particular behavior, the truth is that the pathways are still there. And so if you get triggered, it's really easy to go back down that path, that particular pathway in your brain. So being able to rewire the brain takes a lot more time. Let's talk about the effects on the brain. We're going to talk about three particular ways. One thing to keep in mind is that the brain shrinks because there are of the toxins in the body. So the brain is actually shrinking. Another thing is that the brain cells are going to be poisoned by the toxins that are not being metabolized by the liver. When you think about somebody having one drink of alcohol, eventually that's going to get metabolized or pushed out of the body. But when somebody's continually partaking of the substance, the liver is never going to be able to metabolize that, and the poison of the toxins is going to stay in the body and go somewhere. Also, remembering that the nervous system is going to be damaged as the person lacks nutrition. When somebody's taking a lot of a substance or a drug, they are not going to be as focused on eating because their body and their brain is thinking that the thing that they need the most is the drug. Also, when alcoholics are drinking so much, that is that is so much liquid that they're consuming. Nobody consumes that much liquid normally, unless they're an addict. And so, that is obviously going to be replacing habits of eating, properly. Here we're going to talk about neurotransmitters. A lot of you might remember some of this from your previous course. We've got dopamine and serotonin that we're going to talk about. So dopamine is considered the feel-good neurotransmitter. I like to think of that as like kind of an excitement feeling, right? It's kind of like a rush of joy. Um, Depletion of dopamine is what accounts for binges, tolerance, cravings, obsessive behavior, right? When we're depleted of that, then those are the things that occur. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter involved in sleep and sensory experiences, and it's going to give us a sense of well-being. So I like to think of these as both really good feelings, but dopamine is more of that excited good feeling, and serotonin is that peaceful good feeling. And we really need both of those to feel content and happy in life. It's really important that we kind of have a balance of those. With serotonin, when we have decreased levels, right, that's going to be associated with intoxication, depression, anxiety, aggressive behavior, and also suicidal behavior. Okay, a little bit more on addiction as a brain disease. When we think about, taking drugs, one thing that, people often comment is that when people first take drugs, it's by choice. And that is true. That is true that whenever somebody intakes a substance, it's usually by choice that they take it. But most people do not know that they will become an addict. Most people assume that they will be able to drink or smoke weed or try a drug, and that they won't necessarily be locked into doing that unless they choose to do that. But it's a little bit different for the addict because drugs cause a surge in the levels of dopamine. So now we find that drugs can become more important than survival needs. Our brains are trained to respond to a rush of dopamine, and typically that should happen when we eat, when we have sex, or when we're trying to avoid being eaten. So right nowadays, that's probably more like exercise for us. But it's really common that our brains would respond to those type of activities because they fuel survival. But when drugs are providing an artificial surge of dopamine that is higher than these, our brain is going to start responding to that stimuli as being the most important because that is a huge dopamine splash, and our brain is in a way created to respond to that. And what ends up happening is that an individual becomes addicted. So what we find with addiction is that as someone continues drug use, the brain is going to start to produce lower levels of dopamine below the original baseline that the brain was producing on its own. And as that happens, we also find that the frontal lobes are being impacted, and we're less likely to be able to control our cravings, right? Everything that's happening in the brain is kind of fueling this new cycle of responding to the drug and craving the drug. Here we have kind of an analogy with some stoplights, and hopefully this will help simplify it as well. So one thing to remember is that with drugs, the brain is going to be tricked into thinking that the drugs are part of the survival system. So it's kind of like the drugs create a green light that says go on the craving all the time, right? Keep partaking of this drug, keep getting dopamine, right? And as it does that, and there's lower levels of dopamine, right? We're not producing our baseline in our brain anymore. Then addicts are going to want to use just to feel normal. We become more desperate for the dopamine. So the stop system is also impaired. We're thinking of the prefrontal cortex. This is a thing that helps us to make good decisions, prevents us from making bad choices, kind of more long-term thinking. So the drugs are also impacting this system, and we're not able to make good judgments any longer. So when things are working right, the go system and the stop system are going to be things to protect us and help us to survive. But when the addiction process is taking place in our brain, all these things are being changed and weakened, and we find that our brain is telling us to do something entirely different than what it should be. Here we kind of have a diagram, and this is going to continue on to the next slide, but this also might be another way that helps you conceptualize what's really going on in terms of the addiction cycle. So the first use of the drug, we're going to find that there's a dopamine spike that's higher and longer than ever before, right? Our brain is experiencing this new experience of a dopamine splash. This is a very pleasurable experience. So our brain is going to record that and is going to want to repeat that. I'm sure that all of you can think of a time when you've done something and you said, that is so great, it was so awesome, I had such a great time, I want to do that again. So this you can imagine that this is how our brain works. We remember the things that we enjoyed so that we can do them again, so that we can keep enjoying our lives. This is a very normal process, but with drugs, obviously, it's taking on a whole new meaning. So in between uses of drugs, dopamine is going to return to the baseline. So what happens is that a memory is going to be triggered, and then the addict is going to have a desire to repeat. So even though we return to the baseline, now we've got a memory, and our brain is remembering, oh yeah, we really did have a lot more dopamine then. Let's do that again. So then we're using the drug again. Dopamine levels are going to recede this time below the baseline. So each time that the person is getting high, it's not going to be quite as high as the previous time. It's a little bit less, which makes for a deeper crash. And so as the person uses, they keep needing to use to get back to feeling normal, right? It becomes necessary just to get a normal level of dopamine that they have to keep using this. And this is kind of one of the ways that I like to differentiate between use and maybe addiction, is that when you're using every now and then, you would still be able to get a high. Addicts are no longer feeling high. They're no longer feeling pleasure because their brains have changed, and they are literally using whatever, whether it's a behavior, like sex addiction or gambling, or it's an actual drug. They have to do this just to feel normal. So this is why we see the go system is on at all times, right? We're desperate to feel normal. So I already talked about this on the last slide, but the brain is reducing the production of the dopamine, and then we see that people have to use the drug in order to feel normal. Here's another diagram that helps you see the process of addiction, right? First we see there's some drug use over to the top left. There's a surge in dopamine. The brain wants the pleasure repeated. The brain is going to see this as a need for survival, and then drug use becomes necessary no matter what, because it's survival at this point. So a few points to remember as we wrap up this presentation is addiction is a disease that involves genetic predispositions, just like any other disease. So in order for a gene to be turned on, there has to be certain environmental factors. So if the environmental factors are not there, addiction will not occur. So that's important to realize, that you're not doomed to developing addiction just because your parents were addicted. But that does mean that you may have to be more careful about your environmental factors than the next person. And really, we all should be careful about our environmental factors, right? That has to do with, our stress levels, our families, and we're going to talk about a few risk factors here in a little bit. I'd like for you to ponder a question with me. If you remain abstinent, does that mean that you won't get the disease? Is that possible? And can we expect that people, would be able to abstain from alcohol and drug use? What I have found in my practice is that sometimes I've met individuals who maybe come from addict backgrounds, or families that have addicts in them, and they may choose to abstain. But sometimes what can end up happening, and this can happen for people even not from an addict family, is that they will develop what's called a process addiction. That might be an eating disorder, that might be self-harm, that might be gambling, that might be shopping, that might be a sex addiction. So I think it's important to realize that we're finding that there are a lot of different ways to be addicted and for these changes in the brain to occur. Substances, obviously in some ways make it easier because they are mind altering. But it is possible to become addicted to something else other than, drugs and alcohol. Another thing that I find is that sometimes when I have clients in recovery, they will sometimes, what I like to call like changing seats on the plane or on the bus, right? They may stop their drug use, but then they develop a sex addiction. So they find a different way, an unhealthy way to cope, but something that seems to produce a same high level of dopamine, or the level they're accustomed to. So I think it's really important to realize that it may or may not be possible. Obviously, if you never partake of something, you're not going to become addicted to it, so you're saving yourself from that. But I'd like you to think about that, and if you want, include that in your comments on the discussion board. What do you think about abstaining? Is that something that we should think about? So now we're going to talk about risk factors for becoming an addict. So obviously we have the genetic part, where if parents and siblings are addicted, then you have a greater risk. Diagnosed with a conduct disorder, right? So if somebody's aggressive or has a conduct disorder, they're going to have extra risk factors. Untreated ADD or ADHD, exposure to trauma. I have found that a lot of my clients in recovery have experienced trauma, often sexual trauma. I don't know that that's across the board, but sexual trauma is something that's very common, and especially in addicts, I find that it's common. Stressful life transitions. Maybe you've been using prior to these stressful times in your life and it was never a problem, but now all of a sudden it becomes a problem. Or maybe you never used before and then something stressful happens in your life and you start using and find that you become addicted. Conflict at home, obviously any kind of conflict or stress, emotional stress is going to put you at risk. Exposure through peer pressure, this is, I think, is a very important one. The age of someone's first use really increases your risk, especially if you're under age 15. So keeping that in mind, that the sooner they partake of the substance, the more likely they are to respond in a way that maybe leads to addiction. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about co-occurring disorders, because I think this is a really important part when we're talking about addiction and recovery. So let's first define it. A co-occurring disorder is having a mental health disorder and an addictive disorder simultaneously. So when you have a mental health disorder, I think that is a huge risk factor for addiction. And this is why, because when you have a mental health disorder and things are not correct in your brain chemistry, it's really helpful to self-medicate, but that can also lead to addiction. So I find that often happens. It also can become very difficult for treatment because it's one of those chicken or egg situations where sometimes we don't know if the person had a mental health disorder prior to the addiction or if addiction created changes in the brain that have now left the person with a mental health disorder. So I think it's really important to keep assessing as you go through treating someone who has a co-occurring disorder so that you can continually be on your toes and be assessing what this person might need in their treatment of the addiction and both the mental health disorder as well. Okay, so this is the last slide we're going to look at, and this is just kind of a side-by-side comparison to kind of help you think about addiction as a disease, particularly a brain disease, right? And here we're looking at disease as an organ plus a defect plus symptoms. Okay, so we see side by side that the organ in diabetes is the pancreas. In addiction, the organ is the brain, particularly the midbrain. The defect in diabetes is insulin production. The defect in addiction is going to be physical cellular hedonic defect. Okay, in diabetes, the symptoms are going to be high glucose levels. In addiction, we're going to see that the symptoms are the craving, the obsession, the preoccupation. So I hope this helps you to conceptualize addiction as a brain disease, and hopefully as you think about this as a brain disease, that changes some things for you. I'm curious, and you can include this on your discussion board post, but I'm curious about how thinking about addiction as a brain disease changes the way that you would maybe treat an addict in a professional setting, and also if an addict was your loved one, would this change anything for you knowing that this is a brain disease? And maybe would it change something for someone you know who is an addict if they knew that this is what was going on? So I look forward to hearing your opinions and your thoughts on this subject, and thank you for listening.